ladies and gentlemen, and today is a very different episode of Ada Y. I have a very special guest joining me right now. It is my grandfather, Dr. Gary Wright, who was at the first Asbury Revival, which I can now say was the first Asbury Revival because now there have been two. Now, and for those of you who don't know, this guy is my grandfather, and he is the founder of Rotor Knoll. But his life really changed at the first revival, so we're going to ask him a few questions about it. First one is, well, how are you doing?
Doing great, and it's been fun following the week of revival activity at Asbury again.
Now, why were you there at the 1970 Asbury Revival?
Well, I almost missed it because I was a freshman, and I had really planned to go to a different Christian college with your grandmother, and we were both going to go to this Christian college. But I right at the last minute, I changed. I'd been accepted at Asbury and this other college, and I knew I was supposed to go to Asbury. I just wanted to go to college with your grandmother, and we'd been going together for a good while, and so I went to Asbury as a freshman. Uh, Asbury at that time had really strict rules. Didn't like it much. Um, Planned to I decided, I think, during we were on the quarter system, and during that first quarter, I decided this is gonna be my last year here, you know, and, because I just was not comfortable, there, and, found it depressing, and, didn't have any kind of, similar freedom that I'd had at home with my parents, and I really wasn't a troublemaker, so I found it really restrictive. And but I was a freshman, and it everybody at Asbury at that time, all 1,200 of us, had an assigned seat in the chapel, and I was assigned. All freshmen were assigned seats in the balcony. The Hughes Auditorium, where the revival is going on now, uh, is exactly the same wooden theater seats.
You can
Everything's
you can see it on the pictures I pulled up. It's literally the same layout with the seating
yeah,
and the
yeah.
balcony and the stage. It's crazy.
So same color of paint on the walls, and
Yep.
and that sort of thing. And the only thing is a little bit different now is a little bit on the stage, uh, eh, because they had a huge, awesome pipe organ, uh, and that's a little bit different now because they've brought modern technology into the pipe organ, and so all that's a little bit different. But that's about the only thing that's changed, and so it's interesting just seeing the pictures this past week, and uh, it's pretty exciting.
So you were there as a freshman at Asbury. What was it like? Because everything I did a bit of quick research on this. From what I read on this first one, it was started like any regular service, and then all of a sudden, a couple students started sharing, and then that
Yeah.
seemed to have this avalanche effect. So, what was that like? How did that all happen?
Well, let me tell you what it was a Tuesday morning, and we had chapel on Tuesdays at 10, Thursdays at 9, and believe it or not, on Saturday mornings at 8 o'clock. And those were required. If you missed more than three, you got to go home and see mom and dad permanently. And so uh, I was in line going in the door near the stairs to the balcony. And these people were talking in front of me. And one of them said to the other one, said, "Did you hear about the prayer meeting last night?" And the other one said, "No." They said, "God told us that revival is going to break out today in chapel." Um, I was sarcastic, thinking, and I didn't say anything. I just thought, wow, oh, we got a prophet running around on campus here, and uh, the, and the other person said, well, I heard that uh, Dean Reynolds, which was the academic dean, is having a testimony chapel today. And I thought, with my Quaker background, where you sit sometimes in long periods waiting for somebody to give testimony, uh, I thought this is going to be boring. This was before wireless microphones. Uh, the auditorium seats 1,500 people. How are you going to hear somebody? I immediately had all these negative feelings about it. So I went up to my assigned seat in a really critical attitude. And sure enough, it was a testimony tadpole. But the first thing that happened was that the academic dean, Dean Reynolds, he gave his testimony. Now he wasn't vocationally a uh, pastor or minister. He was an academician and pretty normal guy, really. And I think he'd done a little coaching along the way in sports, but he gave his testimony how he came to Christ, and then he opened it up for other people to share. And the longer the chapel went on, the stronger the presence of the Lord came. And by the time it got to the end, you know, I constantly didn't feel right with God. And part of it was just a real inferiority complex that I'd developed. And, I always thought God was mad at me. And most of the time, because I was mad at me. And towards the end there, I got really uncomfortable, because the presence of the Lord is so strong, and I could think of a long list of things that he ought to be upset with me about. And so when the bell rang in the middle of people still giving testimonies, uh, I was ready to go to class for maybe the first time since I'd been on campus. It seemed like a good time to go to class and leave this building. And Dr. Hunter, who was not, he was kind of, I think he was drafted by Dean Reynolds to come help him because they could sense something was about to happen. And I've seen in writing the conversation they had while people are giving their testimony, and they knew God was there himself. And I think he drafted Dr. Hunter to come up and kind of close things out or lead things. And Dr. Hunter got up and he basically just gave an invitation for anyone who sensed they needed to talk to the Lord or apologize to the Lord to come forward to the altar. Well, immediately, I'd say well over 100 or maybe even 200 people crowded around that really long altar there in Hughes Auditorium. And it was on. And when people finished praying and getting peace in their heart at the altar, they started going up to the podium because that's about the only way they could be heard, because it was very orderly, but yet, people are weeping and crying, and not only is the altar full, but people had to move out of the front row of seats, one or two rows, so that people could pray there, because there was no room at the altar anymore geographically, and people started giving witness to what God had just done in their hearts. And the presence of the Lord just kept increasing to the point that you could feel a physical weight. The word in scripture, the word glory means weight, and the glory of the Lord is heavy. And uh, my experience often with it is I struggle sometimes to breathe in that presence of the Lord. And you go through the Bible and look at, when God shows up in people's lives, they usually hit the ground and are physically impacted as well as emotionally, mentally, spiritually impacted. There's usually a physical. You have Moses back there in the Old Testament saying, when God passed by, and the moment God passed by Moses, he said, "Oh God," he said, it says he fell to the ground and began to repent of sin for the whole nation of Israel, not himself and them. And that's usually the reaction. Uh, you see these crowded altars, and usually, like this last week, you saw people kneeling in the aisles of the auditorium, praying, and often it's because there's no room left up front. And uh, they would sing songs. Another professor who was involved in music got up and would lead in songs, and there were favorites that took place. It lasted 8 days, 24 uh, hours around the clock. And uh, it took me, I think, about a day and a half before I left the auditorium. Uh, you'd go to the restroom and come back. Maybe you would run and get something to drink or a meal. But the reason you hurried back is that such exciting things were being reported. For instance, people would get up and say, they'd tell what God had done for them at the altar, and then they'd say, I'm going to go call and they would name maybe their parents or their brother and sister or a friend, and usually we would stop and pray for that situation, and then they'd leave. And the only way you could call somebody then was to go to the payphone in your dormitory. There wasn't any other, you know. So there was long lines on the payphones, and but then people would come in, burst back in the side door of the auditorium on each side of the stage, and they would often be just that they couldn't contain their joy. And often you'd see the person who was giving their testimony at the podium would just back up and let that other person who just entered the auditorium take over. And they'd start telling how they called home, and the people on the other end of the phone all gave their lives to Christ. I mean, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. And it was just amazing. And um, I've never gotten over it, Addison. I've never gotten over it.
Life changing experience for sure. And one of the biggest things that made it just so life changing was for so many people is how it spread. You already
Yeah.
mentioned it a little bit that there were technological things back then that we don't have now, and I'll get into that later about how it's spreading now. But how did it spread then? Because there was no social media, there was no live streaming of the event. You just mentioned that you had to run to your dorms to make a phone call. So how is it that this spread out throughout the
Well,
nation?
invitations started coming to uh, both formally to the college to send teams of witnesses to churches, to colleges. Um, God traditionally in North America has sent revival to college campuses, and then it spreads back to the home churches of the students. and then beyond. And for instance, you ask how did it spread? I can give you an example. Is that I was asked to go on a witness team to Anderson, Indiana, to the South Meridian Church of God. And of course, then it was Asbury College and it was Anderson College, both universities now. But when we arrived on Saturday evening, I I along with the other guys that were on the team went to the men's dormitories. The girls went to the ladies' dormitories and invited people to the 10:30 service at South Meridian the next morning. And and the place was it was a really big crowd that showed up at South Meridian Church of God. But the service didn't end. All we did was just get up and tell how the revival infected us. We had one singer, uh, Chrissy Sanchez, and she got up and sang without him. She has Latino background, and when she sang "Jesus, oh Jesus," she sang it in English, and then she sang it in Spanish. And somehow, when she sang it in Spanish, it just melted hearts, and she would sing "Cristo, oh Cristo." It just melted hearts. I don't know why. There was a whole bunch of this. I don't understand why it worked like it did, but there was about two or three different altar invitations for people to come and pray, and uh, and it just wasn't people at the altar. There's people every space you could imagine that was in the place was full of people kneeling, and in the aisles, and uh, it turns into kind of a a little bit chaotic, not in what's being said or that sort of thing, but people weeping and so many people in one spot praying. And we opened the altar for people, I know at least three times to come, and it was full each time. And finally, they closed it like at 1 o'clock and said to ask us if we'd come back and do a service that night. We did. It was even more people there that night, and and the same kind of thing. Of course, we were a little concerned because we'd said everything we knew to say in the morning service. So what are we going to say? Well, we just said whatever was on our heart, and none of us were. There was just one guy who was a seminary student that led the group, and the rest of us were novices, so we didn't know what we were doing. We just and Chrissy sang her. She sang her song again, and I think she sang some time during the night. She sang "He Touched Me," and then they said to us, "Well, you guys don't have school on Mondays, right?" And we said, "No." They said, "Well, would you do a service Monday night?" We all looked at each other, and we already said tonight what we didn't know to say because we'd said everything we knew to say Sunday morning, but we did. And Monday night, there were people standing because there were no seats left. And same kind of thing, just singing, giving witness, people talking about how, their lives were changed. And then they said to us, you can go back to Asbury campus now, but we're going to go on with this. And they went 50 straight days. They say between 5 and 7,000 people gave their lives to Christ during that time period. And um, wow. And then people like me went on to other places, and every place you'd go and tell about it, it would happen again there. And it was normal to go to a church that had, say, 150, 200 people, and to see almost everybody in the place on their knees at the altar, asking God's forgiveness. seeking forgiveness from each other, making restitution, and that's how it spread, and it just kept spreading. People whose lives were changed would go be a witness to what they experienced, and wherever they go and give that witness, it happened there.
Yeah, it's so interesting how that, I mean, that just happened church to church and just kind of spread like a wildfire. And well, one of the crazy things now is like people don't even know how to report on this. Like they don't even know the verbiage to say. I've went and did a quick Google search on it, and you can see just how people don't even know how to talk about this. And you can tell like the Christian websites know how to word it, but like the mainstream media, you got NBC News, Kentucky Asbury University quote unquote revival going viral on TikTok. They have no idea how to word this and no idea what's going on. Which is very
What
interesting
I
to
read I
me.
read, today, they don't know what to call it. Yeah, and they don't. And here I am 53 years later from the 1970 event, uh, and I still struggle to find the vocabulary to describe what I experienced then and have experienced. I mean, this shaped my whole life. Um, every time I get up publicly to speak, I expect the same kind of response. Not because of me, but because of what I saw him do when I was a freshman in college, and then what I saw after that as we just I mean, I didn't know how to preach. Uh, you know, I had my witness of what happened, and then I worked on one sermon for months, because I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't want to mess up what I'd seen him do. I didn't want to get in the way, and so it really seemed like the 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 less skilled you were as a presenter, the more God used you. I would say that's one of the characteristics of this. It's not about professional presentation. It's about people giving witness to the presence of God in their life and what He is doing. And so, people who need every little detail planned out in a service and that sort of thing, they're in trouble. Because this is just bigger than any human being, because it's God Himself, and so
Yeah, it's just very interesting all that's going on. Now, if I had asked you last Thursday, could the 1970 Asbury Revival have happened again? What would your answer be? And can what's going on now occur even, 20 years from now?
well, the only thing I would, I don't like to correct my grandson here, on this, but this happened in 1950 at Asbury. There's a whole book there on the shelf, uh, there in the library studio that you're in, on spontaneous revivals at Asbury. And they go back to its genesis, to its beginning. And the author lists all the different times revival has come. I would say that the 1971 was the most impactful up to this one, but a lot of it had to do with, okay, today technology, and people are live streaming this revival right now. They're looking, and they didn't have that in '70s. So I think this has the potential to be more impactful. And in 1970, we had uh, it was enhanced because people could travel easier. Uh, we had more dependable transportation. both vehicles and people. I mean, colleges who wanted to have the witness from the 70, they flew campus leaders, all the way to California, and then eventually into other countries. And so I think this particular one has the potential uh, to spread around the globe. I think it's already doing that. But for some reason, Asbury has been a, it's not been the only place that God has brought revival to the college campus, but I don't know any school that's had it more often than, and they don't plan them. I mean, they do plan events, where they have music and preaching for a week or something like that. But uh, this is, the title of that other book is Spontaneous Revivals, where it's not planned, he just shows up.
Yeah, shout out to your book. He just showed up, where I think you give your story of the 1970 revival as well.
Yeah.
Um, so last question for you: how important is this moment right now that you think is going on? What do you think would be some of the biggest aftershocks of this event right now?
Well, the 70 revival was during one of the most turbulent times uh, up to that point in the history of the United States, as far as uh, the they just burned the ROTC building down on the University of Kentucky campus just in the weeks prior to the 70 revival. It was just a time of chaos throughout the country, especially on college campuses where they were protesting the Vietnam War and all that. And God brought, for our country, this revival came, here to Kentucky and then spread all over the East Coast and West. And at the same time, out in California, the Jesus movement or the Jesus revolution happened. And it was the same era, same time, and they kind of combined, and it brought the message of Jesus, love, unity, peace, shalom, uh, into a very chaotic culture. I think this that we're experiencing today has the same possibility. Uh, our country, our world is in such a mess, and here are people standing in line, long lines to get into a building because God has showed up in that building. And so they have three auditoriums going right now in Wilmore, Kentucky, and people are standing in line. And when they leave, they describe, "I felt peace, I felt loved," you know, uh, and um, I think it has the potential to bring change to communities and neighborhoods. It has to. It has to. The local churches have to catch fire and do something about their neighborhood, and they have to do something different than what we've been doing, because what we've been doing, for the most part, hasn't worked. Now you have one of the differences is I think as a result of the 70s, you have mega churches. You have these large congregations of 100, of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, or more. Those did not really exist in the 70s. There were some, but they were exception. And um, you know, one of the results, I think, of that whole era is that you have interdenominational churches, the more community churches, because revival doesn't care about the name on the door, and there's a unity that comes. I mean, here's all these people sitting in these three auditoriums in Wilmore and other college campuses now. I today, I heard the report in our prayer meeting of 24 college campuses that are experiencing revival. Nobody is talking about what denomination they are or what church they go to. They're talking about Jesus. And that's one of the characteristics of true revival is the unity of the believers, the followers of Christ. And so, and we live in a culture in the United States and other countries where we're so nasty to each other. You can't already make a statement without somebody disagreeing with you in a nasty way. Well, you know, this is the opposite of that. And so I really believe that there's a potential if the local church it catches on fire as a whole, uh, there's a potential that communities and neighborhoods and countries will be changed. And um, so I find it extremely exciting and thus far really encouraged.
All right. I'd like to thank you for your great words here, and I'd like to thank you for your time. Everyone needs to make sure they can go check out Conversations with Gary. That is his YouTube channel. It's also on other podcasting platforms. Make sure you go check it out. Dr. Gary Wright, I thank you for your time.
And also on Spotify, they can go to a podcast where uh, one of the gentlemen who I invited to the Anderson Revival, uh, his life was changed. And he has a Spotify show, me and my 88 friends, which he's a keyboard player. So those are his 88 friends. But Lawrence Tuning, and he and I, um, he interviewed me like you did uh, several years ago, and then again yesterday. So there's several of us out there trying to spread the word that this seems to be an awakening of unusual proportions.
All right. All right. Thank you for your time.
Love you, buddy.